It's just past 7:30 p.m. across India. Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get you top stories from India and the region. I'm Tanvi Taneja. And for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in Washington, D.C., Nick Harper. Hi, Nick.
Good morning, Tanvi. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. It's 3 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, we'll have the latest from Israel as ceasefire talks continue, and Uber settles a lawsuit with thousands of taxi drivers in Australia. But first, the headlines.
India, China, North Korea, Iran congratulate Putin on his re-election along with Bolivia, Cuba and Venezuela. But Western governments and the EU decry Putin's election victory. Planes airdrop humanitarian aid into Gaza as Israel offers 6-week Gaza truce for 40 hostages in Qatar talks. Israel confirms killing a senior Hamas leader at the Al-Shifa hospital raid. The death of Mahak Amini in custody of Iran's morality police was unlawful and caused by violence, says a UN fact-finding mission. And electioneering heats up in India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi holds public rallies in Karnataka, Telangana and Tamil Nadu in his mega South push today. Russian President Vladimir Putin secured a landslide victory in the presidential election, cementing his rule for another 6 years amid the conflict in Ukraine. Putin won the re-election with 87.28% of the votes, figures published by the country's Electoral Commission, with all the votes counted now. The turnout was more than 77%, also the biggest win in Russia's post-Soviet history.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is all set for another 6-year term in office as he secured a landslide win in the country's presidential elections. He called the result as a proof of Russian people's trust as the turnout exceeded 70%.
87 million of our dear voters took part in the election. That means the turnout was record high and unprecedented. It has never been as high before. It is 77.46%.
Putin reiterated Moscow's position on the Ukraine conflict. He said Russia is waiting for talks on a French proposal which calls for a ceasefire in Ukraine during the Olympic Games, but said he would keep Russia's interests on the front line into account.
We are ready to discuss any issues, but as always, within any situation, we will proceed from the interests of the Russian Federation and, of course, the situation at the front line.
Amid strong Western reactions surrounding the election and the conflict in Ukraine, he dropped a stern warning that any interference from Western troops will prove to be a catalyst for Third World War.
I have already said this, and it is clear to everyone that this will be just one step away from a full-scale World War III. I don't think anybody is interested in this.
Putin also spoke about opposition leader Alexei Navalny and plans about a prisoner swap before his death in prison last month.
Unfortunately, what happened is what happened. On one condition only, I said, we will change it so he doesn't come back, let him sit there. But things happen. There's nothing you can do about it.
Случилось то, что случилось.
If President Putin completes his full term by 2030, he'll surpass Joseph Stalin to become Russia's longest-serving leader over more than 200 years. Bureau Report, DD India.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in a social media post, congratulated Vladimir Putin on his re-election as the President of the Russian Federation. In a social media post on the platform X, Prime Minister Modi looked forward to working together to further strengthen the time-tested, special and privileged strategic partnership between India and Russia in the years to come. So, reacting to Russia's presidential election and Putin's landslide victory, the White House National Security Council spokesperson termed the elections unfair, citing Putin's suppression of political opponents there. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky denounced the Russian polls as illegitimate, calling for Putin to face trial in The Hague. Germany, the UK and Slovakia also criticized the results due to the imprisonment of political opponents and censorship, while British Foreign Secretary David Cameron said the polls were not free and fair. But leaders of China, Bolivia, Cuba and Venezuela congratulated Putin on his re-election. Meanwhile, the French media discussed the exceptionally high percentage of votes in Putin's favor, reflecting a Soviet result. The French Foreign Ministry said conditions for a free and democratic election were not respected in Russia. DD India's Dasha Chernyshova has more on the Russian response to the West's criticism of the election from Moscow.
Well, as expected, Moscow says it is nonsense and absurd to call the election in which 87% of the voters cast their ballot for the incumbent President Vladimir Putin as illegitimate. The Kremlin has dismissed all the criticism coming from the Western countries, saying that if they say the election was illegitimate, then these 87% of people who cast their ballot for Vladimir Putin are illegitimate as well. And obviously, the Kremlin is now pointing to the fact that the turnout in this year's presidential election has set the new record in Russia's modern history, reaching 77%, with almost 99% of the ballots already counted. The Kremlin from the very beginning was saying that it was prepared for this sort of reaction to come from the Western countries, but at the same time, Moscow does insist that all the voting procedures have been taken in line with the international norms.
European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, in a sharp response, said that the Russian presidential elections happened in a restricted environment.
We have seen the Russian elections, and a statement from the 27 will be issued after the Council. But I want to anticipate that this has not been free and fair elections, no OSCE observation, highly restricted environment. This is diplomatically what I can say, but more than that, this election has been based on repression and intimidation and being held on the Ukrainian occupied territory, violating Ukrainian sovereignty.
And in the latest from the conflict, 2 people were killed and 4 were injured in the Ukrainian shelling of the village of Nikolskoye in Russia's Belgorod region. Attacks on Belgorod have taken place frequently since 2022, but have escalated in the run-up to Russia's presidential election, which concluded on Sunday. Meanwhile, Ukrainian Air Force claims to have destroyed 17 out of the 22 Russia-launched drones overnight. On to West Asia now. Truce talks with Israel and Hamas are resuming in Qatar today, where Israel has offered for a 6-week truce for 40 hostages. My colleague Nick Harper is in Washington, D.C. and gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Nick, over to you now.
Well, Tanvi, continuing their operations in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli Defense Forces have confirmed that they've eliminated the head of operations directorate of Hamas's internal security, Fak Mahmoud. The senior Hamas operative was hiding in a compound at the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza, from where he was reportedly operating and advancing terrorist activity. Stalled discussions aimed at securing a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas are expected to resume in Qatar, as Israel is sending a high-level delegation headed by the Mossad chief on Monday. The talks are designed to secure a 6-week truce, under which Hamas would free 40 hostages. Israel says this stage of negotiations could take at least 2 weeks. The talks in Qatar would mark the first time that both Israel and Hamas leaders have joined negotiations since the start of the holy month of Ramadan. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reaffirmed his determination to launch an offensive in Rafah. Netanyahu said Israel would push into Rafah, the last relatively safe place for Hamas in Gaza. But he also asserted that Israel will not leave civilians trapped when its forces begin the assault on the southern Gazan city.
Our goal in eliminating the remaining terrorist battalions in Rafah goes hand in hand with enabling the civilian population to leave Rafah. It's not something that we will do while keeping the population locked in place. In fact, we'll do the very opposite. We'll enable them to leave because our consideration for reducing and minimizing civilian casualties has guided us and will continue to guide us in the future.
Israel has refused entry into the Gaza Strip for the head of the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency. While addressing the media in Cairo, UNRWA chief Philip Lazzarini, alongside the Egyptian Foreign Minister Samet Sukri, stated that he had planned to travel to Rafah on Monday, but was informed an hour beforehand that his entry had been denied. Well, to get more on all of this, DD India's correspondent Alex Carrier joins us live from Amman in Jordan. Alex, the situation in Gaza is getting worse, more desperate by the day. What's the latest on all of this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Nick. It is a humanitarian catastrophe. There's no question about that. And we've just seen a UN-backed report in the last hour or so saying that northern Gaza is weeks away from total famine and that 70% of the Gaza Strip would have to live with catastrophic hunger. And that will be the case in May if nothing changes. We also have a report from UNICEF saying that malnutrition among children is reaching unprecedented levels. We've heard from the WHO and from the United Nations that malnutrition and dehydration among children is a problem. Increasing numbers of children are dying in the hospital of malnutrition and dehydration. Crucial, therefore, that aid can get into Gaza as quickly as possible. But of course, the situation is also desperate and dire for those more than 100 hostages still being held in Gaza, those Israeli hostages whose loved ones are desperate to get them back. We know that 86-year-old captive had to mark his 86th birthday yesterday in captivity. That is the level of suffering from those Israeli hostages as well. And that desperate situation, both for Palestinian civilians and for Israeli hostages, puts more pressure on the negotiators in Qatar, more pressure on the international organizations trying to get aid into Gaza, and certainly more pressure on the Israeli government to do more to help the Palestinians in Gaza.
And Alex, you mentioned that aid. What are you seeing in Jordan in terms of efforts to get more aid into Gaza?
Well, Jordan is playing a coordinating role. We know that one of the air bases here is being used by several countries to do these airdrop flights into, or over, I should say, the Gaza Strip, dropping around 8 tons of food, of baby formula, of other necessities into Gaza directly. We know that this is a slightly faster way of doing it because the goods here don't have to go through Israeli checks, but they are organized by countries like Jordan, of course, which is doing its own airdrops. And we've seen German aircraft. Singapore is also here doing their airdrops, and the United States also doing airdrops into Gaza. That is one way, but it is inefficient. One aircraft takes about half what a truck could take, and it is expensive. It costs about 7 times more to airdrop than it would to drive by road. The other avenue, of course, to get aid into Gaza is that maritime corridor. We've seen that World Central Kitchen ship docking on that makeshift jetty in northern Gaza. That's makeshift jetty made of the rubble of the buildings that have been destroyed in the last few months. But that, again, is still a trickle compared to what Gaza needs. And we'll have to wait until the Americans build that artificial pier before we can see the amount of aid that is needed going in. Of course, the most effective, most efficient way of getting aid into Gaza would be by road, but still there is friction, there are slowdowns on Israeli and Egyptian checkpoints into Gaza that make that route very, very difficult to get through. So a lot of pressure on Israel, which the Israeli government say they are doing everything they can to allow extensive aid into Gaza through air, land and sea. Aid organizations on the ground see it slightly differently, but either way, the pressure's on.
Thank you, Alex. That was Alex Carrier joining us live from Amman. Well, earlier on Monday, Gazans gathered outside an UNRWA warehouse to collect humanitarian aid. Large crowds were seen waiting outside the facility. As the conflict between Israel and Hamas enters its 6th month, aid organisations have raised concerns about pockets of Gaza facing malnutrition. The EU's 27 foreign ministers gathered on Monday in Brussels to discuss the situation in Gaza and sanctions on both Hamas and Israeli West Bank settlers. Arriving at the meeting, the EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said he was confident the EU could agree on sanctions. The bloc's member states will also talk about the EU-Israel Association Agreement, though they will not discuss a suspension. Well, that's it from here in Washington. Tanvi, back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Nick, for joining us. Nick Harper joining us from DC. Now, India and the US are conducting a bilateral tri-service humanitarian assistance and disaster relief exercise called Tiger Triumph 24 on the US eastern seaboard from the 18th to 31st of March. Indian Navy ships, Indian Navy aircraft, Indian Army personnel and Indian Air Force aircraft and helicopters, along with the Rapid Action Medical Team, will be participating in the exercise. The US would be represented by US Navy ships with embarked troops of the US Marine Corps and the US Army. The exercise is aimed at developing interoperability for conducting HADR operations and refine standard operating procedures to enable rapid and smooth coordination between forces of both the countries. You're with us on DD India Global, still to come on the show. Pakistan carried out 2 airstrikes inside Afghan territory, says ruling Taliban. And 3-day startup Mahak 2024 gets underway in India's national capital, Delhi.
$10 लाख की लॉटरी मुझे, वाओ!
फर्जी ऑफर्स से सावधान।
RBI कहता है
जानकार बनिए, सतर्क रहिए।
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I'm Tanvi Taneja. A United Nations mandated fact-finding mission on Monday declared the death of Mahsa Amini in the custody of Iran's morality police as unlawful and resulting from violence, highlighting the ongoing discrimination against women in the country. The incident occurred in September 2022 when 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, a Kurdish Iranian woman, died while detained for allegedly breaching the Islamic dress code. Her death had sparked widespread protests across Iran, posing a significant challenge to the country's clerical leadership, the most substantial one in decades. Now on to Caribbean nation Haiti, where turmoil and famine have forced thousands of citizens to flee into the neighboring Dominican Republic, leading to heightened tensions in the border areas. According to the United Nations, the ongoing violence and disorder have displaced 360,000 people in Haiti, with over half of them being children. The deteriorating humanitarian crisis has pushed people to their limits, prompting desperate parents to send their children across the border to escape hardships. Now, the Indian Navy has said that it is going to bring the 35 Somali pirates who hijacked a merchant vessel to India for persecution. The Navy rescued the merchant vessel Ruin and its 17-member crew in a major operation that went on for 40 hours and led to the surrender of the pirates. The Indian Navy has been constantly working on an anti-piracy operation in the region.
We are investigating all suspicious vessels which have a piracy trigger and this ongoing operation. So while doing this, we came across this MV Ruin, which was being used as a pirate mothership. So we had deployed our ships, so the pirates have surrendered. There were a crew of 17 personnel on board. 7 from Bulgaria, 1 from Angola, and 9 from Myanmar. So they are all safe, and the ship is now being sent back to its next port of call.
Staying in Asia, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban said on Monday that Pakistan carried out 2 airstrikes inside Afghan territory in which 8 women and children were killed. A Taliban spokesman strongly condemned the strikes on Afghan soil, calling it a violation of the country's sovereignty. The Pakistan Army and the Foreign Office did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The groundbreaking Startup Mahak 2024, a unique 3-day event uniting India's entire startup community, commenced at New Delhi's Bharat Mandapam on Monday. Former Niti Aayog CEO Amitabh Kant and Commerce and Industry Ministry Secretary R.K. Singh graced the inaugural session. With over 50,000 business delegates vying to participate, the event will host over 1,000 applicants from across the globe. India now ranks 3rd globally in startup ecosystems, and the Mahak aims to further raise its stature.
All of you must actually first become an AI company. First become an AI company and then do everything else. Reverse, re-engineer, completely become an AI company. That will make you transform. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This Mahak, to my mind, is a great, great event. It really brings a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for India.
More from India. As election campaigning is picking up, a senior BJP leader and Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed a rally and a public meeting in the southern state of Karnataka. The state's ardent supporters welcomed Prime Minister Modi in the city of Shivamoga. Earlier, the Prime Minister addressed a public meeting in Telangana as well. He said that he's ready to take on those who proclaim to put an end to Shakti. He was referring to opposition leader Rahul Gandhi's remarks. He said that he's a worshipper of Shakti and those who represent it, such as the mothers, sisters and daughters of India. PM Modi is addressing multiple rallies and meetings in southern India in his southern mega push ahead of Lok Sabha elections later this year.
मैं भारत मां का पुजारी हूं। मैं आप शक्ति स्वरूपा सब माता बहन बेटियों का भी पुजारी हूं। और जिन्होंने कल शिवाजी पार्क में इंडियन अलायंस ने अपना घोषणा पत्र शक्ति को खत्म करने के लिए किया है, मैं इस चुनौती को स्वीकार करता हूं और मैं इन शक्ति स्वरूपा माताओं बहनों की रक्षा के लिए जान की बाजी लगा दूंगा।
Southern state of Tamil Nadu's Chief Minister M.K. Stalin and the state's Congress President K. Selva Perunthagai held a meeting to discuss seat-sharing formula for the upcoming general elections. The Indian National Congress has formed an alliance of 40 political parties for the upcoming general elections. And we now take a look at other stories making news around the world. Members of climate movement Extinction Rebellion protested outside the London headquarters of British broadcaster GB News on Monday. Protesters sprayed the building with black paint and blocked the entrance with a metal tripod. Bulgarian Foreign Minister Maria Gabriel of centre-right GERB party agreed on Monday to form a new government following the resignation of Prime Minister Nikolai Denkov on March 5th. Gabriel accepted the mandate with a sense of responsibility as the country needs stability. Iranians celebrate Nowruz, the Persian New Year, with wishes for peace, prosperity and happiness. People crowded at Tehran's Grand Bazaar on Monday to shop for food, clothes and decorative items ahead of New Year. In the Iranian calendar, Nowruz marks the first day of spring and the vernal equinox and is celebrated by more than 300 million people all around the world. And something for dance lovers now, as ballet enthusiasts are filling the Mexico City main square wearing tattoos and ballet slippers for a massive dance class. The event was organized by the city government as part of activities organized for what they say is the Women's Month. So that's it for this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter and Instagram at DD India Live. We'll be back here with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.